Kappa by RYUNOSUKE Akutagawa. Translated from the Japanese by SEIICHI. Chapter 1. One summer morning 3 years ago, I left an inn at Kamakochi Hot Spring to climb Mountain Hodaka with a rucksack on my back. As you know, the ascent of Mountain Hodaka can only be made by following up the narrow valley of the Azusagawa. I had climbed that mountain before, and even Mountain Yargadake. So I went up the valley without a guide, although it was very foggy that morning. For about an hour, which seemed to me a very long time, I walked in the fog, but there was no sign of its lifting. On the contrary, it grew thicker. It grew so thick that I almost made up my mind to go back to the inn at Kamakochi. But it was of course impossible to go back unless the fog lifted, and the beastly blur kept growing thicker and thicker. Damn it. Better go up, I said to myself, and struggled on through the tall growth of bamboo grass, taking great care not to go astray from the watercourse. I could see nothing but a wall of dense fog, though the monotony was broken at intervals by fresh green leaves on low-hanging branches of a beech or of a fir tree. Grazing horses and cows also loomed unexpectedly before me, but they were blotted out in an instant. In the meantime, hunger and weariness got the better of me, and my wet clothes and blankets were heavier than I could easily bear. I gave in at last, and, guided by the sound of the water running against the rocks, groped my way down to the bottom of the valley. I sat down on a rock by the stream to take a meal. I think I had spent about 10 minutes cutting open a tin of corned beef, gathering dead twigs and making a fire. Meanwhile, the fog was lifting fast, as if it had brought me all the way down for the sole purpose of making a fool of me. Biting at a piece of bread, I looked at my wristwatch. It was already 20 minutes past 1. But what surprised me more was a strange, weird-looking face reflected for an instant upon the round glass of the watch. I looked back, and for the first time in my life I saw Kappa. It was standing on a rock behind me, with one arm round the trunk of a white birch and one hand shading its eyes, watching me with intense curiosity. I was taken aback and for a while sat motionless. The Kappa seemed frightened too. The hand over its eyebrows did not make the slightest movement. Then suddenly I jumped to my feet and sprang upon it. The Kappa took to its heels. I thought it did. As it was, it made a dodge and was gone. I looked round in amazement through the tall bamboo grass and found it a few yards away looking back at me, ready at any moment to fly. But there was nothing strange in that. The odd thing about the devil was the color of its skin. When it was on the rock watching me, it was gray all over. Now it was green from top to toe. Confound you! I cried out and again sprang upon it. Of course it ran away. And for more than half an hour, I gave it a furious chase through the bamboo grass and over the rocks. The Kappa was a very good runner, by no means slower than a monkey. Many a time, while running after it like one in a delirium, I was on the point of losing sight of it. Many a time I slipped and fell. But when the Kappa came to a place where a huge horse-chestnut tree spread its boughs, a fierce-looking ox with powerful horns and bloodshot eyes blocked its way. The Kappa gave a strange scream and jumped head over heels into an unusually tall growth of bamboo grass. Now I've got it, I said to myself, and in no time jumped in after it. But there was a pit or something, I suppose, which I did not see. For hardly had I touched the smooth back of the Kappa when I fell head forward into deep darkness. Now, even at such a moment of crisis, the human mind indulges in the most unimportant thoughts. The moment I was off my feet, I thought of the Kappabashi, a bridge near the inn at Kamakochi Hot Spring. And then, well, I do not remember what happened after that. I only saw something like a flash of lightning before my eyes and lost all consciousness. Chapter 2. When at last I came round, I found myself lying on my back surrounded by a large number of Kappas. One of them, who wore pince-nez over his thick beak, was kneeling beside me, listening to my chest with a stethoscope. When I opened my eyes, he motioned me to keep quiet and called to someone at his back, "Quacks, quacks." Presently, 2 Kappas came up with a stretcher. I was laid upon it and was carried gently for several hundred yards through crowds and crowds of Kappas. The street looked very much like the Ginza, main street in Tokyo. Behind the beech trees that lined it on both sides could be seen all kinds of shops with sunshades, and between those rows of trees numberless motor cars were running to and fro. Soon my stretcher turned into a narrow by-street and was carried into a house. It was the dwelling place, as I learned later, of that Kappa who was wearing pince-nez, a doctor called Chak. Chak laid me down on a neat bed and gave me a glass of some transparent liquid medicine. I lay quietly on the bed and let him do what he pleased with me, for I was aching so badly in every joint that I could scarcely move. Chak came to see me 2 or 3 times every day. And Bag the Fisher Kappa, I mean that Kappa I had met in that foggy valley, he also called on me at least once in 3 days. Kappas know much more about human beings than we know about them. Perhaps it is because they capture us more often than we capture them, though, strictly speaking, I am not sure that they exactly capture us. Anyway, quite a number of people had visited the land of Kappas before me, and many of them had stayed there till the end of their lives. For in that country we enjoy the privilege of living without working, simply because we are not Kappas but human beings. Bag once told me of a young navvy who had come by chance upon the land and married a she-Kappa and lived with her until he breathed his last. The she-Kappa, Bag said, was not only the prettiest in that country, but was remarkably clever at deceiving her husband. After a week or so, it was decided, according to the law of that country, that I should live next door to Chak as a specially protected inhabitant. My house was neat and cozy, though it was rather small. Of course, the civilization of Kappas does not much differ from that of mankind, at least from that of the Japanese. For instance, there was a small piano in a corner of the drawing room which faced the street, and a framed etching on the wall. The only complaint I had was that not only the house itself, but the tables and chairs were all made for Kappas and therefore, like children's furniture, were a little too small for me. Every evening I saw Chak and Bag in this room, that is, in the drawing room, and learned the Kappa language from them. Of course, I had many other visitors. I was a specially protected inhabitant, as I said before, and naturally every Kappa desired to have a look at me. Gale, for example, often came to see me. He was the president of a glass manufacturing company and used to send for Chak every day to have his blood pressure examined. But my best friend during the first 2 weeks or so was Bag the Fisher Kappa. One late afternoon, I remember the air was moist and warmish, We were talking in my drawing room with a table between us when suddenly he fell into silence and, with his large eyes wide open, began staring at me. I did not see what he meant, so I asked in the Kappa language, "Quacks, bag, quo qual quan?" I say, "Bag, what's the matter?" Bag said nothing, but kept staring at me. Then he jumped to his feet, stuck out his tongue, and showed signs of springing upon me like a frog. I was frightened and rose stealthily from my seat and was just about to dash out of the room when, to my great joy, Dr. Chak came in. "Hey, Bag, what are you doing?" Chak glared at Bag through his pince-nez. Bag looked crestfallen and, raising his hand over and over again to his head apologetically, said, "I'm sorry, sir. Awfully sorry." But it was really so amusing to see this gentleman scared that I couldn't help playing a little joke on him. Then he turned to me and added, "I beg your pardon, sir." Chapter 3. Before proceeding further, I think I must give you some idea of the animals called kappas. People still doubt whether they exist at all. But they do. There can be no doubt about it since I myself actually lived among them. They have a short-haired head and webbed hands and feet, like those pictures in the Suko Kurayaku, a study of the water tiger, and other books. Their average height is about 3 feet 4 inches. Their weight ranges from 20 to 30 pounds, according to Dr. Chak, though he says that there are some extraordinarily big ones who weigh more than 50. The top of their heads is concave, forming an oval, dish-like hollow, and this dish seems to grow harder with years. For instance, old Bag's dish was quite different to the touch from young Chak's. But what is most remarkable about kappas is that unlike human beings, they change color according to their surroundings. For instance, when they are in the grass, they are just as green as the grass, and when they are on a rock, they are just as gray as the rock. I think they have something in their skin tissue that chameleons have in theirs, for chameleons, you know, have the power of changing color. The discovery of this strange fact reminded me of a book of folklore which says that the kappas of western Japan are green and those of northeastern districts red. It also brought back to my mind how Bag had disappeared in that foggy valley when I had tried to catch him. It seems that kappas have a very rich deposit of fat beneath their skin. They never clothe themselves in spite of the comparatively low temperature, about 50 degrees F, of their underground country. Of course, they wear spectacles and carry cigarette cases and pocketbooks and other things with them. But they get along very well without clothes or pockets because, like kangaroos, they have a nice pouch on their bellies. One thing that struck me as being very funny was that they did not even wear a loincloth. I once asked Bag why they didn't. He went off into a fit of laughter and, with his body bent back, cackled and cackled away until he said, "I should like to know what makes you cover yourself." Chapter 4. Little by little I learned the everyday language of kappas, as well as their manners and customs. What puzzled me most was their topsy-turvy way of making fun of what we take seriously and vice versa. Take, for example, justice and humanity. They are very serious matters to us. But if you mention these things before kappas, they are sure to shake their sides with laughter. Perhaps it is because their idea of what is funny is entirely different from ours. I was once talking with Dr. Chak about birth control when suddenly he burst out laughing, his mouth wide open, shaking himself so violently that he nearly dropped his pince-nez. I was naturally offended and questioned harshly what made him laugh. Jack's answer was something like this. I am not quite sure about the details, because at that time I was not very familiar with the Kappa language, but the gist of what he said was something like this. But it isn't fair for the parents to care only about their own convenience. It's too selfish, isn't it? From our human point of view, there is really nothing more funny than the way in which a Kappa gives birth to a child. Shortly after that conversation about birth control, I went to Bag's house to see his wife in childbed. Kappas do the same thing as we do when they lie in. They get a doctor or a midwife to help them. But when at last the child is about to come out, the father puts his mouth at of the mother as if he were on the telephone and asks in a loud voice, "Do you wish to be born into this world? Think it over and give your answer." Crouching on his knees, Bag repeated this question several times. Then he took a bottle of disinfectant from the table and rinsed out his mouth. The child in his wife's womb seemed to be somewhat constrained, for it replied in a very low voice, "I don't wish to be born. In the first place, I don't like to inherit your blood." The insanity alone is horrible enough to think of. In the second place, I believe in the wickedness of living a Kappa's life. Bag looked embarrassed and scratched his head, while the midwife in attendance quickly inserted a big glass tube of Bag's wife and injected some liquid. She heaved a deep sigh of relief, and at the same time her belly, which had been so big, shriveled up like a balloon emptied of its hydrogen gas. As might be expected from the answer of that fetus, Kappas can walk and talk as soon as they are born. Chak once told me that he knew a child Kappa who, on the 26th day after birth, gave a lecture on the existence of God, though he died in his second month. By the way, when I had stayed in that country for a month or two, I saw a big poster at a street corner. On the lower part of it were painted about a dozen Kappas, some blowing trumpets, some armed with swords. The upper part was covered with spiral Kappa characters that looked like watch springs. A student Kappa called Lap, who was walking with me then, read them to me in a loud voice, and I noted down every word very carefully. I am afraid that here again I may have made some minor mistakes in my translation, but this is about what those spirals said. Join Heredity Volunteer Corps. If you are healthy Kappas, marry unhealthy Kappas to eliminate hereditary evils. Of course, I told Lap on the spot that it was altogether impracticable. But my remark made all the Kappas around the poster, as well as Lap, burst into guffaw. Impracticable? But judging from what you told me, it is actually done in your country, isn't it, just as it is always done here? Some of your sons of good families fall in love with their maidservants, some daughters with their chauffeurs. What does that mean? The fact is, they are eliminating hereditary evils. Only they don't know what they are doing. Moreover, I should think that our volunteers are much nobler than those human volunteers you spoke of the other day who kill each other for a mere railway line or two. Lap's big belly was rippling with suppressed laughter, though he talked with a serious look on his face. But I could not afford to join in the mirth, for while I was off my guard, one of the Kappas robbed me of my fountain pen. I hurriedly tried to seize him. However, the slimy skin of Kappas makes it by no means easy to catch them. The devil slipped like an eel out of my hold and ran away as fast as he could, his body, which was as thin as a mosquito, bent forward almost to the ground. Chapter 5. I am as much indebted to Lap as to Bag the Fisher Kappa. They both helped me in many ways. But it was Lap who introduced me to another Kappa named Talk. Talk was a Kappa poet. Of course he had long hair, for Kappa poets wear their hair long just as our poets do. I often went to see him by way of killing the time. He looked as free of care as could be, smoking and writing poems in his little room decorated with alpine plants in pots. He was a free lover and had no wife, but I used to find a shikappa in a corner of the room, knitting or something. He always welcomed me with a smile, though it was not very pleasant to see a smiling kappa. At first it made me feel rather uneasy, but he would greet me with a smile and say, "Hello. Glad to see you. Old chap, won't you sit down?" He often talked about the life and art of kappas. He believed that there was nothing so foolish as the life of ordinary kappas. Parents and children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, all derived their sole pleasure from tormenting each other. Especially, he said, the family system was absurd beyond all absurdities. One day he pointed out of the window and said disgustedly, "Look at those fools." On the street outside, a young kappa was trudging along almost out of breath, carrying 7 or 8 kappas around his neck, including 2 old ones that seemed to be his parents. I was much moved by the sight and praised the young kappa for his spirit of self-sacrifice. Said the poet. "You will make a good citizen in this country too. By the way, are you a socialist?" Of course I said, "Qua," which is the Kappa word for yes. "Then I suppose you are ready to sacrifice a genius for the sake of 100 common beggars. What are you then?" I asked. "Someone told me that you are an anarchist." "No, I'm a Superman," declared Talk defiantly, though, literally, he said he was a super kappa. He had his own view of art. He maintained that art should be unfettered by any rules of life, that it should be art for art's sake, and that therefore an artist should first of all be a super kappa and be above good and evil. But Talk was not the only kappa that held this view. All his poet friends seemed to be more or less of the same opinion. Tak often took me to the Super Kappas Club, where I found all sorts of Super Kappas, poets, novelists, dramatists, critics, painters, musicians, sculptors, and amateur lovers of art. They were always talking merrily in the salon under bright electric lamps. Or sometimes they were proudly showing one another how Super Kappa should act. For instance, I once saw a sculptor among the tall ferns planted in pots, holding a young kappa in his arms and playing eagerly with his. At another time, a shikappa, who was a novelist, stood on the table before us and drank 60 bottles of absinthe at a stretch, though, unfortunately, when she had done with the 60th bottle, she fell down to the floor and expired on the spot. One bright moonlight night, Talk and I were walking arm in arm on our way home from the Super Kappas Club. Talk was unusually low-spirited and did not say anything at all. After a while, we came to a small lighted window, through which we saw 2 kappas, evidently husband and wife, sitting at dinner table with 3 child kappas. Talk heaved a deep sigh and said, "I think I am a super kappa in my relations with shikappas, you know, but I can't see such a scene of family life as that without a touch of envy." But don't you think you are contradicting yourself? For some minutes, the poet kept standing still in the moonlight with his arms folded, watching in silence the 5 peaceful Kappas and their dinner table. Then he replied, "Anyhow, those scrambled eggs there are more wholesome than any love affairs." Chapter 6. In fact, lovemaking among Kappas is quite different from ours. The moment a Shikappa comes upon a likable Hikappa, she takes any means whatever, fair or foul, to catch him. An artless girl Kappa simply runs and runs after the Hikappa. I myself once saw with my own eyes a Shikappa rushing like mad after a Hikappa. But it is not only the girl Kappa that gives the chase. She is often reinforced by her parents and brothers and sisters. Oh, how miserable the Hikappa is! For even if by good fortune he could escape from the Shikappa after running about a great deal, he would certainly be confined to bed for a few months at least. One day, when I was reading Talk's poems at home, I was surprised by Lap the student, who tumbled in and fell flat on the floor and gasped out, "Heavens, I was caught at last." I threw down the book of poems and locked the front door at once. But through the keyhole I could see a girl Kappa, who was very little and had her face powdered with sulfur, still hanging around. Lap was laid up in my bed for some weeks, and what was worse, his beak gradually became rotten and at last fell off. Occasionally, I admit, a Hikappa also chases a Shikappa, but that is because the Shikappa entices him to do so. I once saw a Hikappa running wildly after a Shikappa. The Shikappa, while running away from him, came to a stop on purpose from time to time, or walked on all fours. Then she allowed herself at the right moment to be caught quite easily as if she had been exhausted. The Hikappa lay there on the ground for a while, with the Shikappa in his arms. And when at last he got up, oh, how disappointed, how regretful, how miserable he looked. But he was not the worst case. I saw another Hikappa, a little fellow, running after another Shikappa. The Shikappa, as is usual with Shikappas, was making her seductive escape when there came from the opposite direction a tall and stout Hikappa, snorting furiously. She saw him and ran straight up to him, screaming, "Help! Help! He'll murder me!" In an instant the big Kappa seized the culprit and held him down in the middle of the street. Poor fellow! The little Kappa grasped at the air 2 or 3 times with his webbed hands and passed away under the very beak of the Shikappa, who was now clinging fast with a broad grin to the neck of the big Kappa. All the Hikappas I knew were chased by Shikappas. Even Bag, who had wife and children, was not only run after, but was actually caught on 2 or 3 occasions. The only exception was Mag, a philosopher who lived next door to Talk the poet. He never had the misfortune. Probably it was because he was too bad-looking, or because he kept indoors most of the time, or both. I called on him now and then to have a chat. He was always sitting at his high-legged desk in his dusky room, reading bulky books by the light of a 7-color glass lantern. One day we discussed Kappa's lovemaking. Why doesn't the government adopt stricter measures to prevent female Kappas from running after males? I asked. It is partly because there are very few female Kappas among the government officials, replied the philosopher. Female Kappas are more jealous than male Kappas, And if only we had more female officials, I am sure male Kappas would be chased less often and enjoy a more peaceful life. But very little could be expected from that after all, for even among their official circles, female Kappas would run after male Kappas. Then I suppose that you are happier than any other Kappa? Mag rose from his chair, took my hands in his, and said with a sigh, "It's quite natural that you don't see how we feel, because you are not a Kappa. But occasionally I myself desire those dreadful Shikappas to run after me." Chapter 7. I often went to concerts with Talk the Poet, and I remember one of them in particular. It was the third concert I attended in that country. The hall looked much the same as a similar place in Japan. On the seats raised above one another, some 300 or 400 Kappas were listening enraptured, each with a program in his or her hand. I was sitting on a front seat, in company with Talk and his Shikappa and Mag the philosopher. By and by, after a cello solo, there appeared on the platform a strangely small-eyed Kappa, carelessly carrying his music books under his arm. According to the printed program, this was Krabak, a celebrated composer. But it was not necessary to look at the program. I knew him by sight. He was a member of the Super Kappas Club to which Talk belonged. Lied Krabak. Their programs, like ours, were mostly written in German. Amidst a thunderous clapping of hands, Krabak just bowed to us and stepped quietly to the piano. Then he began as carelessly to play a lied of his own composition. Tak used to say that he was by far the greatest musician that had ever lived in that country. I was interested not only in his music, but also in his hobby lyrics, so I listened intently to the melody that came from the big bow-shaped piano. Talk and Mag seemed to be spellbound. But the Shikappa, who was very pretty at least in the eyes of Kappas, was sticking out her long tongue impatiently from time to time, grasping the program viciously. She cherished bitter hatred towards Krabak, Mag said, because she had failed to capture him about 10 years before. Full of passion, Krabak continued his performance on the piano as if he were fighting, when all of a sudden the hall rang with a thunderous voice, "Stop." I was surprised and looked back and saw an extraordinarily big police Kappa sitting entirely at ease on a back seat. No doubt the order had come from him. "Stop playing," he shouted again louder than before. Then all was wild confusion. Tyranny. Down with police tyranny. Play, Krabak, play on. Idiot. Beast. Get out. Don't give in. And amid these tumultuous cries, chairs were overturned, programs flew, stones and empty bottles of cider and half-bitten cucumbers came down like rain. I was amazed and asked Talk what on earth all that was. But he was too excited to pay attention to me. Standing upon his seat, he was shouting at the top of his voice, "Play, Krabak, play on." Even his Shikappa, who seemed to have lost her animosity towards the musician, was screaming out, "Police! Tyranny!" So I turned to Mag and asked, "What's all this?" "Oh, these things happen very often in this country. Paintings and literary works, Ducking his head whenever anything came flying over his head, Mag went on placidly. As a general rule, anyone can see more or less clearly what is expressed in a painting or a literary work. So their sale or exhibition is never prohibited in this country. but musical performances are often banned. For however injurious they may be to public morals, they are not appreciated by those Kappas who haven't got an ear. But has that officer got an ear for music? Well, it's doubtful. Maybe that melody reminded him of the beating of the heart he feels when in bed with his wife. The confusion grew, and almost complete anarchy reigned in the hall. Krabak remained at his piano looking back upon us with a lordly air. But with all his lordly air, he was obliged to dodge the bottles and cucumbers and other missiles that came flying at him. So there was a hasty change in his admirable posture every 2 or 3 seconds. But, generally speaking, he managed to keep the dignity of a great musician and stuck to his place, his small eyes shining fiercely. As for me, well, I was hiding myself behind talk to avoid the missiles, but I was curious and talked on with Mag. Unreasonable censorship, don't you think? Well, no, replied the philosopher. It's more advanced than the censorship of any other country. Take Japan, for example. Only about a month ago, they actually, at that moment, Mag was hit right on the top of his head by an empty bottle, and with a quack, a Kappa interjection, fell down unconscious. Chapter 8. Somehow I liked Gale, president of the glass manufacturing company. Gale was one of the biggest capitalists. Probably no other Kappa in the whole country had a bigger belly than his. How happy he looked in his easy chair with his lychee-like wife and cucumber-like children beside him. I often went with Judge Pep and Dr. Chak to dine with him and used his letters of introduction to see various factories with which he or his friends were connected in some way or other. One of the most interesting was a book factory. A young Kappa engineer conducted me over it and showed me giant machines run by hydroelectric power. I was deeply impressed with the enormous progress the Kappas had made in their mechanical industry. The engineer told me that the annual production of the factory amounted to 7 million volumes. But what struck me with wonder was not the quantity of the output, but the remarkably simple process by which so many millions of books were produced. For in that country, books are manufactured merely by throwing paper, ink, and gray-colored powder into the funnel-shaped mouths of the machines. In less than 5 minutes, these materials are poured out in torrents of books printed in quartos, octavos, etc. I asked what that gray-colored powder was. The Kappa engineer, who was standing before the shiny black machines with an air of importance, replied indifferently, "Oh, just rubbish, brains of asses dried and ground to powder. Current price is 2 or 3 cents per ton." Of course, bookmaking is not the only branch of industry where such miracles are accomplished. Picture manufacturing and music manufacturing are done by no less wonderful processes. In fact, according to Gale, an average of 700 or 800 new machines are invented every month, and things are produced on a larger and larger scale with less and less labor. The result is 40 or 50,000 more Kappas thrown out of work every month. But while in that country, I did not even once come across the word strike in the newspapers which I used to read every morning. It struck me as being very strange, so that at one of the dinners at Gale's, to which I was invited together with Pep and Chak, I asked what the reason was. "They are all eaten up," said Gale nonchalantly, a cigar between his lips. I did not see what he meant by eaten up. Chak, who was wearing pince-nez as usual, seemed to have perceived my bewilderment and explained, We kill all those workers and eat their flesh. Just look at this newspaper here. This month, 64,769 workers have been dismissed, and the price of meat has dropped accordingly. Do they meekly consent to be killed? I asked. It's no use making a fuss, said Pep, who sat frowning by a wild peach in a pot. We've got the workers' butchery law. I was disgusted, of course. But not only Gail the host, but also Pep and Chak seemed to take it all for granted. Indeed, Chak even laughed and said in a mocking way, "After all, the state is so good as to save them the trouble of starving to death or of committing suicide. Just a little poisonous gas, you see, and they are done for. So they don't suffer much pain. But how can you eat? Oh, don't be silly." If Mag heard you, he would surely break out into roars of laughter. In your country, some of the low-class girls become prostitutes, don't they? It is sentimentalism to be indignant over the custom of eating workers' flesh. Gail, who had been listening to all this, took a plate of sandwiches from a table near at hand and offered it to me. "Won't you have some?" he said coolly. "This is the flesh of one of those workers." I was so shocked and nauseated that I ran out of the drawing room into the darkness of the night, with the laughter of Pep and Chak behind me. The sky was threatening. Not a single star was shining above the houses. And all the way home I kept on throwing up pale, whitish liquid, leaving it here and there on the dark road. Chapter 9. But Gail, president of the glass manufacturing company, was certainly an amiable Kappa. I often went with him to the club of which he was a member and spent a pleasant evening. I felt much more at home there than at the Super Kappa's club to which Talk belonged. Gail was not much of a thinker as Mag the philosopher was, but he opened my eyes to a world entirely unknown to me, a world wide and strange. He always chatted in good spirits, stirring his coffee with a gold spoon. One very foggy evening, I was listening to Gail with a vase of winter roses between us. The room was of secessionist style, if I remember right, and was furnished with white tables and chairs with thin gold borders. Gail looked more self-complacent than usual, and with a bright smile all over his face talked about the Korax cabinet then in power. Korax is only a meaningless interjection like, "oh." But it was the name of a political party whose primary concern was supposed to be the promotion of the welfare of the Kappa race. "The Korax party is under the control of Lop," said Gail. "As you know, he is a famous Kappa statesman. Bismarck said that honesty is the best diplomacy, but Lop is honest not only in his diplomacy, but also in his management of home affairs." But that speech of Lop's come now, just listen. That speech of his is of course a lie, every bit of it. But as everybody knows that it is a lie, it is an honest speech after all, isn't it? No one but you and your countrymen will call it a lie simply because it is a lie. We Kappas do not, well, it doesn't matter. What I am going to tell you is about Lop. He leads the Korax party, as I said just now, but behind him is another Kappa who is pulling the wires. It is Kaka, president of the POFO. POFO, which is the name of a newspaper, also is a meaningless interjection, and the only Japanese equivalent I can think of is But Gail went on, even Kaka hasn't the right to call himself his own master, because he is under my control. Under your control? But I understand that the POFO is a friend of the labor classes, isn't it? How is it that Kaka, its president, should be under your control? The Kappas on the POFO are of course friends of laborers, replied the capitalist. But they've got to obey Kaka, who is their master. And Kaka can't get along without my support. Gale was playing with his solid gold spoon, smiling good-naturedly. I said nothing. He made me feel sorry for the poor faux Kappas rather than hate him. But my silence seemed to have betrayed my feeling, for, swelling his big belly, he said, but all the POFO Kappas are not the friends of laborers. After all, we Kappas love ourselves more than we love anybody else. Well, Kuka is under my control, you see, but to make matters more complicated, there's another Kappa pulling strings behind me. Who do you think it is? It's my wife, that lovely Mrs. Gale. And Gale gave a loud laugh. Which makes you happy, I suppose? Well, I'm contented, anyhow, though I'd never say so among my fellow Kappas. I'm talking frankly now because you are not one of us. Then the Korak's cabinet is after all controlled by Mrs. Gale? Does it come to that? Anyhow, Kappa was no doubt the cause of that war we had 7 years ago. War? Did you ever wage war? Why, yes. It may at any time break out again. As long as we have a neighboring country, to tell the truth, it had never occurred to me that the Kappas had a neighbor nation. Gale told me that the Kappas always regarded the Kawaiosos, otters, as their potential enemy, and that the Kawaiosos maintained armaments no less powerful than those of the Kappas. I had never heard of the Kawaiosos being a formidable enemy of the Kappas. Nothing had ever been said about it even by the author of SEIICHI, a study of the water tiger, or by Mr. Kunio Yanagida, author of that admirable book of folklore entitled Santo Mandanchi. It was an entirely new discovery. So I took great interest in the story of the war between the two races. Before the war, Gale continued, both countries were busy making military preparations and were jealously watching each other. The Kawaiosos were afraid of us, and we were no less afraid of them. And in that tense atmosphere, it happened one day that a Kawaioso, who was staying in this country, paid a visit to a Kappa and his wife. Now this Kappa had secret designs to dispose of her husband. He was a regular rake. Besides, the insurance money on his life may have tempted her in some measure to commit the crime. Do you know them? I asked. Not both. I only know the husband. My wife speaks of him as if he were a damned rascal. But I think that he is not so much a rascal as a maniac obsessed by the fear of being caught by Kappas. Well, the Kappa put a dose of prussic potassium into her husband's cocoa cup and gave it in mistake to the guest Kawaioso, who of course died. And then the war? Yes, for unluckily the Kawaioso was a holder of an order. Who won the war? The Kappas, of course. As many as 369,500 brave Kappas were killed in battle. But the losses were negligible compared with those of the enemy. Almost all the furs we have are Kawaioso furs. I sent coal cinders to the front during the war, besides manufacturing glass. Coal cinders? What for? Food, of course. Kappas eat anything when they are hungry. But don't take it ill. But the poor Kappas at the front, well, it would cause scandal in my country. It does in this country too. But as I go about telling people about it, no one is scandalized. Mag the philosopher, says, "Confess thy misconducts of thine own accord, and they will all vanish." Moreover, my heart was burning with patriotism, as well as with the desire of making money. Just then a boy servant of the club came in. He bowed to Gale and said, as if reciting, "A fire broke out next door to you, sir." Fire. Gale jumped up from his seat, and so did I, when the boy added calmly, "But they've put it down, sir." He made another bow and went out. Gale looked after him with a mixed expression on his face, as if he were on the point of laughing and crying at the same time. And suddenly I became aware of the feeling of hate that had been brewing in me for this president of the glass manufacturing company. But now he was standing there before me, not a great capitalist, but just a common Kappa. I picked a winter rose from the vase and put it in his hand, saying, "I'm glad the fire has been put out, but Mrs. Gale must be so frightened. Come now, go straight home with this rose." "Thanks." Gale shook me by the hand. Then, with a sudden grin, he added in a low voice, "That house is my property. I shall get the fire insurance money anyhow." I can still recall that smile of Gale's very dearly, a smile which I could neither despise nor hate. Chapter 10. On the day after the fire, Lap the student Kappa came to my drawing room and without a word sank into a chair. "What's the matter, Lap?" I asked, a cigarette between my lips. "You look very much in the blues." Lap said nothing. He sat looking absently on the floor, with his left foot on his right, and his head hung so low that I could not see even his rotten beak. "I say, Lap, what's up?" He raised his face at last. "Just a silly little incident," he said in a sorrowful nasal tone. "I was looking out of my window when I noticed a little flower." "Why, the insect-catching violet is out," I muttered. My sister heard it, and suddenly changing color, flared up. "The insect-catching violet. How can you? Well, of course I am an insect-catching violet, if you like." And mother, who dotes on my sister, joined her in pouring bitter words upon me. "How can it hurt your sister that an insect-catching violet has come out? Probably she took it for catching a Kappa." Then my aunt, who is on bad terms with mother, also took part in the quarrel, and that made matters worse than ever. Moreover, father, who is drunk all the year round, lost his temper at the hullabaloo and began to beat us indiscriminately. And on top of that, my brother stole mother's purse and ran away in a trice, probably to a cinema or something like that. I'm really... Lap buried his face in his hands and began to sob. Of course I sympathized with him and recalled Talk's contemptuous remark on the family system. I did my best to console Lap, tapping him on the shoulder. "Cheer up, old man. These things happen in any family. But if only my beak wasn't rotten." "Oh, you've got to put up with it. There's no help for it. Come now, let's go and have a chat, say, with Talk. Mr. Talk despises me because I can't give up my family so fearlessly as he does." "All right, then we'll go to Kraback's." As I had been on friendly terms with Kraback since that concert, I decided to take Lap to that great musician. Kraback was living in greater luxury than Talk, though not at all like Gale the capitalist. His room was full of Tanagra figurines, Persian crockeries, and other curios, and on a divan under his portrait he was often seen playing with his children. That day, however, we found him sitting there sullenly by himself with folded arms, lots of torn pieces of paper scattered at his feet. Lap was evidently intimidated by the sight, although he had doubtless seen the Kappa on many occasions before in company with Talk the Poet. He made a courteous bow and sat down in a corner. "What's the matter, Krabak?" I asked. "What's the matter?" "Shah, they say that my lyrics are not nearly so good as Talk's, those fools of critics, but you're a musician. Well, I could stand that. But they have the impudence to say that compared with Locke, I'm not worth the name of a musician." Locke was a musician who was often compared with Krabak. But as he was not a member of the Super Kappa's club, I never had the pleasure of talking to him, though his photographed face, that peculiar face with a bent-up beak, was quite familiar to me. "Locke is a genius," I said, "but he hasn't got that modern passion which is so predominant in your music." "Do you really think so?" "Of course I do." Krabak suddenly stood up, arid as quick as thought grasped a Tanagra figurine and dashed it to the floor. Lapt was so frightened that he gave a cry and was about to run away, when Krabak made a sign to him and me not to be scared. "You're no better than those vulgar Kappas who haven't got an ear for music," he said coolly. "I'm afraid of Locke." "Are you?" "Don't put on the modest Kappa." "Why should I put on the modest Kappa? Surely I'd rather do so before those critics than before you. I am a genius. I'm not afraid of Locke in that point." "Then what are you afraid of?" "Something that can't be named, the star, as it were, under which Locke was born." "I don't quite understand what you mean." "Well, maybe you would if I put it in this way. Locke is not influenced by me, while I always find myself influenced by him. That is because your susceptibility— no, it is not a matter of susceptibility. Locke has faith in himself and his work and is quietly doing what he alone can do, while I am always restless. The difference may seem to Locke to be of little account, but I feel it as badly as if he were 10 miles ahead of me." "But that heroic sonata of yours, sir," ventured Lap. Krabak narrowed his small eyes contemptuously and fixed the student Kappa with them. "Shut up," he rapped out. "You know nothing about these things. I know Locke. I know him better than all those poor dogs who prostrate themselves before him do. Come, old chap, be calm." "How could I always think that some being that we don't know has placed Locke before me in order to make a laughingstock of me, of Krabak. Mag the philosopher knows all these things, though he is always shut up in his room poring over dusty old books under that colored glass lantern." "Mag? What makes you think so?" "Just have a look at this new book of his, A Fool's Words. Here you are." Krabak handed, or rather threw me the book. Then, folding his arms again, he said bluntly, "Well, so long." I went out into the street again with Lap, who was completely dejected. Behind the beech trees on both sides of the crowded street stood the shops as indifferently as ever. We walked along in silence, with no definite object in mind. Soon there came from the opposite direction the long-haired poet Talk. He saw us, and taking a handkerchief out of his belly pouch, wiped his forehead several times. "Hello," he said. "You are quite a stranger. I'm going to see Krabak. I haven't seen him for an age." I did not like to let the two artists meet and quarrel, so I told the poet in a roundabout way in what state Krabak was that day. Very well, he replied. Then I'll not see him today. Krabak is a victim of nervous breakdown, you know. I also have been suffering from sleeplessness for 2 or 3 weeks now. That's too bad, I said. What do you say to taking a walk with us? Thanks. Not today. Oh! Talk gave a frightened cry and clutched at my arm. A cold sweat was oozing all over his naked body. What's the matter, Talk? What's the matter, sir? Gasped Talk. I thought I saw a green monkey popping his head out of that motor car. I felt a little anxious about the poet and suggested that he should consult Jack the doctor at once. But it was in vain trying to persuade him. He simply would not listen to me. Moreover, looking at us suspiciously from one to the other, he said, I'm not an anarchist, I assure you. Please remember that. Goodbye. I won't have anything to do with that doctor fellow. We stood gazing vacantly after him. Well, as a matter of fact, not both of us. For, looking round, I found Lap in the middle of the street, his body bent almost to the ground, watching between his legs the unbroken stream of motor cars and pedestrians. I thought that this Kappa too might have gone crazy and hurriedly pulled him up. Hey, what are you doing? But Lap seemed quite all right and replied calmly as he rubbed his eyes, I just tried a topsy-turvy look at the world because the upright view is so very gloomy. But it looks the same either way. Chapter 11. These are some of the passages I found in Mag the Philosopher's A Fool's Words. A fool believes that everybody is a fool except himself. We love nature partly because she does not show us any hate or jealousy. The wisest rule of life for a Kappa is to despise, and yet not in the least violate, the manners and customs of his time. What we have the greatest desire to take pride in is what we do not possess. No one has any objection to the destruction of idols, nor has anyone the slightest objection to his being idolized. But he who can sit at ease on the throne of idols is one most blessed by the gods, a fool, a rascal, or a hero. Krabak had marked this passage with his nail. All the ideas necessary for our life seem to have been already in our possession 3,000 years ago. Perhaps we are only stirring up old embers into new flames. As a rule, all that is characteristic of us is above our consciousness. If happiness is accompanied by pain and peace by ennui, to defend oneself is more difficult than to defend others. Let him who doubts it see how a lawyer gets off. Pride, love, and doubt, these three have been the cause of all evil thoughts and doings, and perhaps of all virtues, for the past 3,000 years. To reduce material desires does not always bring peace of mind. In order to live in peace, spiritual desires must also be reduced. Here again Krabak had left a nail mark. We are less happy than human beings. Human beings are not so highly developed as Kappas. At these words I burst out laughing. To do is to be able to do, and to be able to do is to do. After all, we cannot get out of this vicious circle. In other words, our whole life is contrary to reason. Baudelaire, after he had become an imbecile, expressed his philosophy of life in a single word, woman. But that does not quite show what he was. What he really was is revealed more fully in the fact that he forgot the word stomach in his proud reliance on his genius, his poetical genius, which was enough to support his material life. Here too I found a mark of Krabak's nail. If we were to act strictly in accordance with reason, we should have to deny our existence itself. The fact that Voltaire, who deified reason, enjoyed a long and happy life shows that human beings are on a lower stage of evolution than Kappas. Chapter 12. It was a rather cold afternoon. Having got tired of reading a fool's words, I left my little house to call on Mag the philosopher. When I came to a lonely street corner, I saw a thin mosquito-like Kappa leaning absently against a wall. Who do you think it was? Well, it was that very Kappa who had stolen my fountain pen some time before. I was glad I had got him at last, and called to a stout police Kappa who was just passing by. Will you just examine that Kappa, please? He stole my fountain pen about a month ago. Hey, look here, said the officer to the Kappa, raising the club in his right hand. Police Kappas carry a U-club with them instead of a saber. I was afraid that the thief might run away, but he stepped towards the officer calm and composed, and stood before him with his arms folded, looking defiantly at him and at me. The police Kappa nonchalantly took a notebook out of his belly pouch and asked, "Your name?" "Grook." "Occupation?" "A post Kappa, until a few days ago." "Very well. Now, Grook, this gentleman says that you stole his fountain pen." "Yes, about a month ago." "What for?" "I wanted to give it to my child as a plaything." "And the child?" Here the officer fixed a stern look on the Kappa. "He's been dead for a week now." "Have you got the death certificate with you?" Grook drew out a sheet of paper from his belly pouch. The police Kappa just glanced over it, and with a grin tapped the Kappa on the shoulder, saying, "All right. Sorry to have troubled you." I was dumbfounded and stared at the officer while the thief walked off, grumbling. Then I collected myself and asked, "Why don't you arrest that Kappa? He isn't guilty." "But he actually stole my fountain pen, yes, probably to give it to his child as a plaything. But the child is dead now. If you want to know more about it, please look into Article 1285 of the Penal Code." With these words, the officer walked quickly away. I did not know what to do, so I hurried to Mag's house, repeating between my teeth Article 1285 of the Penal Code. Mag the philosopher likes to have company. That day I found in his dusky room Judge Pep and Dr. Chak and Gale, the president of the glass manufacturing company, smoking freely under the 7-color glass lantern. I was glad to meet Judge Pep, for I thought that he could save me the trouble of looking into Article 1285 of the Penal Code, and as soon as I sat down on a chair I asked, "Don't you punish criminals in this country, Mr. Pep?" Pep, who was puffing away at a gold-tipped cigarette, blew a long breath of smoke toward the ceiling and then replied wearily, "Yes, we do. Sometimes we punish them with death." But about a month ago, I told him all about the fountain pen affair and asked him what Article 1285 of the Penal Code prescribed. Well, it runs, "No criminal shall be punished after the circumstances that have compelled the same to commit the crime have ceased to exist." By this provision, you see, that Kappa who stole your fountain pen for his child has been acquitted of the crime automatically because he is no longer a father. It's ridiculous, I should think. Don't be silly. It is the identification of a Kappa who is a father with a Kappa who is a father that is ridiculous. By the way, the Japanese law regards the two as one and the same person, doesn't it? That is very funny in our eyes. Hoo 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 hoo. Throwing his cigarette end away with a bored look, Pep uttered a sardonic laugh under his breath when Chak, who had very little to do with laws, fixed his pince-nez and put in, "Are there executions in Japan, too?" "Rather," I said. "They are hanged." And turning again to Pep, whose air of cold indifference had aroused a touch of antipathy in me, I made a cynical remark. "You carry out your death penalty in a more civilized manner, I suppose." "Yes," replied Pep as calmly as ever. "We haven't got such a thing as hanging. Electric devices are sometimes used, but only in very rare cases. Usually, we just tell the name of the crime that has been committed." "Is that enough to kill a Kappa?" "Quite. We have more delicate nerves than you human beings." "That is how murders also are sometimes committed," said Gale, smiling amiably, with the purple light of the colored glass lantern reflected all over his face. "The other day a socialist charged me with robbery. It nearly paralyzed my heart." "It seems to me," interposed Mag the philosopher, "that this type of murder is committed more often than is supposed to be. I know a lawyer who was killed in the same way." I looked back. Mag was talking with this cynical smile on his face as usual, his eyes turned away from us. "One day he was called a frog," he went on. "You know that in this country a frog means a cold-blooded wretch. Well, the lawyer was called a frog, and from that day he kept on asking himself whether he was a frog or whether he was not, until at last he passed away." "That's suicide, after all," I commented. "The rascal who called him a frog intended to kill him. But from your point of view, it's just a case of suicide." All at once, Mag was interrupted by a sharp report of a revolver that shook the air on the other side of the wall. Evidently it came from Talk the Poet's house. Chapter 13. We rushed to Talk's house. Among the alpine plants and pots, he was lying on his back with a revolver in his right hand, blood streaming from the top of his concave head. By his side, a Kappa was crying noisily with her face buried in his breast. I lifted her to her feet, though I did not much like to touch the slimy skin of a Kappa, and asked her what on earth was the matter. "I don't know," she said. "He was writing something when suddenly he shot himself through the head." "Oh, what shall I do, cur? This is a Kappa's cry of grief." "Mr. Talk was selfish," said Gale, the president of the glass manufacturing company, to Judge Pep, shaking his head mournfully. "He always insisted on having his own way, you know." But Pep said nothing. He was engaged in lighting his gold-tipped cigarette. Then Chak, who had been on his knees examining the wound, turned to us five with an air worthy of medical profession and said, "He's no more." He was suffering from chronic dyspepsia, and that was enough to make him melancholy. "He was writing something," said Mag the philosopher to himself by way of an excuse, and picked up a sheet of paper that lay on the desk. We all craned our necks, except myself, and looked at it over Mag's broad shoulders. "Now shall I rise and go to that glen beyond this vale of woe, to that rocky glen where the water is cool and clear and the air is sweet with flowering herbs." Mag looked back with an ironical smile and said, "This is a cribbed poem from Goethe's Mignon song." It looks as if Talk's suicide was partly due to the exhaustion of his poetical genius. Just then a motor car drove up, and there appeared in the doorway Krabak the musician. He saw what had happened and stood there motionless for a minute. Then he stepped up to us and shouted to Mag, "Is that Talk's will?" "No, it's his last poem." "Poem?" Mag calmly handed the manuscript to Krabak, whose hair was standing on end. Krabak began to read it intently, with his eyes riveted on it, paying no attention to whatever Mag said. "What do you think about Talk's death?" asked the philosopher. "Now shall I rise and go? My time too may come at any moment to that glen beyond this vale of woe. But you've been one of his best friends, haven't you?" "Best friends?" "Talk never had any friend to that glen beyond this vale of woe, but Talk was so unfortunate to that rocky glen where the water is cool and clear. So unfortunate," pursued Mag, "where the water is cool and clear, you are all blessed to that rocky glen." The sight of the she-kappa still crying bitterly touched my heart. I put my arms softly round her shoulders and took her to a sofa in a corner of the room where a child kappa, apparently about 2 years old, was smiling innocently. I acted the mother kappa and fondled the child for some time until I felt tears well up in my eyes. All through my sojourn in the land of kappas, I never shed a tear except on that occasion. "It is a misfortune," said Gale the capitalist, "to be a member of the family of such a selfish kappa, isn't it?" "Quite so," replied Judge Pep, again lighting a cigarette. He gave no thought whatever to his family. At that moment we were surprised by a loud cry from Krabak the musician. "Capital!" he exclaimed, with the manuscript still in his hand. "I've got a splendid funeral march." With his narrow eyes shining, Krabak just shook Mag's hand and dashed to the door. By that time a crowd of neighboring kappas had gathered before the house and were trying noisily to peep in. Krabak forced his way through them, jumped into his motor car, and whirred away in an instant. "Hey there, don't peep in," shouted Judge Pep, and he pushed the curious kappas out like a policeman and shut the door upon them. The room suddenly became quiet. And in that quietness, amid the smell of Talk's blood mixed with the perfume of alpine flowers, we talked over what we could do for the deceased and his family. But Mag the philosopher was absorbed in his own thoughts, with his eyes fixed on Talk's body. I tapped him on the shoulder and asked what he was thinking about. "About the life of kappas," he replied. "Well, what about the life of kappas? After all, if we kappas want to live a happy life, we must—" Mag looked a little embarrassed and added in a low voice, "It seems to me that we must believe in something greater than kappas." Chapter 14. It was these words of Mag's that made me think of religion. I have always been a materialist, and before that time I had never given any serious thought to religion. But as Mag's words came just when I was moved by Talk's untimely death, I began to wonder what the religion of kappas was. So I asked Lap the student about it when I saw him shortly afterwards. "Well," said Lap, "there are Christianity, Buddhism, Mohammedanism, Parsiism, and other religions. But by far the most important is modernism, or life worship. Life worship is only a rough translation from the original Kappa word kimucha. Cha corresponds to the English suffix ism, and kemu is derived from kemal, which means to live, or more correctly, to eat and drink and. Then you have churches and temples, I suppose, just as they have in Japan and other countries? Why, of course. The Great Temple of Modernism, for example, is the biggest building in this country. Won't you go and have a look at it? One cloudy, warmish afternoon, Lap took me to the Great Temple. He looked very proud. It was indeed a colossal building, almost 10 times as large as the Nikolai Church in Tokyo, a combination of all possible styles of architecture. There was something uncanny about it, about the lofty domes and steeples pointing upward to heaven like so many feelers. For a while we stood in front of the portico. Oh, how small and insignificant we were, even compared with that portico, gazing up at the mountainous pile that looked like a monster of preposterous size. The interior of the great temple also was spacious. Many visitors, just as small and insignificant as we were strolling about among the Corinthian columns. Soon we met with an old Kappa bent with years. Lap made a slight bow and addressed him respectfully. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm very glad to see you in good health." The old Kappa returned the bow and replied in the same respectful manner. "Thank you, Mr. Lap. I hope you've been," he paused. He seemed to have noticed Lap's rotten beak. "Well, you look well, anyhow. But what has brought you here?" "I've accompanied this gentleman. As I suppose you know, he is. Lap talked a great deal about me, but I suspected that he was being talkative because he felt guilty about having neglected for a long time to come to the place of worship. And I shall be obliged, sir," he concluded, "if you will kindly show this gentleman round." The old Kappa priest greeted me with a generous smile and then pointed quietly to a tree on the altar before us. "I am afraid I cannot give you much information," he said. "That is the tree of life which we modernists worship. You see 2 kinds of fruit on it, green and golden. The golden fruit is called the fruit of good, and the green one the fruit of evil." Soon I began to be bored, for the old Kappa's explanation seemed to me but a piece of old-fashioned allegory. I pretended to be listening attentively, and cast a furtive glance now and then to the inner part of the temple. Corinthian columns, Gothic vaults, checkered floors of Arabian fashion, a semi-secessionist prayer-desk, all these combined to produce a strange harmony, savage and beautiful. But what attracted my attention most of all were the marble busts placed in niches on both sides of the altar. I thought I had seen them before. In fact, I had. When he had finished his explanation about the tree of life, the old priest led us to a niche on the right and began to tell who the bust in it was. "This is one of our saints, Saint Strindberg, who rebelled against everything. This saint is supposed to have been saved by Swedenborg's philosophy after many years of struggle and suffering. But as a matter of fact, he was never saved. He was just a life worshipper as we are, or rather, there was no other alternative open to him. If you read his book entitled Legend, you will find his own confession that he once attempted to kill himself. It was a gloomy story, and I looked away to the next niche, where a bust of a German with a large mustache was enshrined. This is Nietzsche, the poet who wrote Zarathustra. This saint looked for salvation to the Superman that he himself created. But instead of being saved, he went off his head. If he had not become insane, he might not have been placed among the saints. The old priest paused for a moment and then led us to the third niche. This is Tolstoy. This saint suffered more than any other man, for as he was of noble birth, he didn't like the curious public to know how he suffered. He tried hard to believe in Christ whom it was practically impossible to believe in, and went so far as to declare that he believed in him. But at last, in his declining years, he grew so disgusted with his tragic lies that he could no longer forgive himself for having told them. It is well known that he was sometimes seized with fear watching the beams of his study. But since he is a saint now, it is obvious that he did not commit suicide. The bust in the fourth niche was a Japanese. When I saw it, my heart naturally warmed with delight. This is Doppo Kanikata, a poet who knew the hidden sorrows of a poor coolie who throws himself before a rushing train. But since you are a Japanese, I suppose you don't want any more explanation. Well, then, let's go on to the fifth niche. This is Wagner, isn't it? I said. Yes, replied the priest. That revolutionist who was a friend of the king. In his old age, Saint Wagner even said grace before his meals. But of course, he was a life worshipper rather than a Christian. Judging from his letters, he seems to have suffered so much that over and over again he was on the point of committing suicide. By this time, we were standing in front of the sixth niche. This saint is a French painter who was a friend of Saint Strindberg's. He gave up his business career and took to painting. He left his wife and children and married a girl of Tahiti who was only 13 or 14 years old. He had the sailor's blood in his thick veins. But just look at his lips. Don't you notice a trace of poison, arsenic, or something? The bust in the seventh niche? But you're tired, aren't you? Well, then, come to my room and take a rest. I was very tired. We followed the old Kappa along a corridor that reeked faintly of burned incense into a little room. In a corner of that room, I saw a black statue of Venus, at the foot of which was placed a bunch of wild grapes. To one who had expected a plain, unadorned monastic chamber, the whole atmosphere of the room was rather baffling. The old Kappa saw how I felt, and before offering me a chair explained half regretfully, "Please remember that our religion is life worship. Live a vigorous life is the teaching of our God, the tree of life. By the way, Mr. Lapp, have you shown our Bible to this gentleman?" No, replied Lapp, scratching the concave top of his head. To tell the truth, I myself seldom read it. Well, said the old priest, smiling good-naturedly, then perhaps you don't know. Our God created this world in the course of a single day. The tree of life is a tree, but there is nothing it cannot do. Then it created a female Kappa. But the female Kappa had so dull a time that she wished for a male Kappa. Our God pitied her and took a bit of her brain and made a male Kappa for her. And it blessed these two Kappas and said, "Eat and live a vigorous life." These words reminded me of Tok the poet. Unfortunately, Tok was an atheist just as I was. It was no wonder that I did not know of life worship, because I am not a Kappa. But Tok was a Kappa. No doubt he knew of the tree of life. I pitied him for disbelieving its teachings and killing himself, and interrupted the old Kappa by saying so. Oh, you mean that unfortunate poet? And the old priest heaved a deep sigh. Our fortunes are determined by faith, circumstances, and chance, to which you would add heredity, I suppose. Unfortunately, Mr. Talk had no faith. I'm sure Talk envied you, I said. So do I. As for Lap, he is still young, and I should be more optimistic, said Lap, if only my beak were all right. The old priest heaved another deep sigh. Moreover, a little water stood in his eyes that rested on the black Venus. To tell the truth, he said, but this is my secret. I beg you will keep it strictly to yourselves. Well, the truth is, I myself cannot believe in our God. But someday, my prayers, suddenly the door of the room was flung open, and a big Kappa sprang upon the old Kappa as quick as lightning. And before either of us could get hold of her, she had thrown him down upon the floor. You shameless old beggar, she cried. Again you stole from my purse to get a drink, didn't you? We were in such an awkward position that we could not stay any longer with the old Kappa and his wife, and about 10 minutes later we were hurrying down the steps of the portico. No wonder the old priest can't believe in the tree of life, said Lap, when we had walked for some minutes in silence. I looked back at the great temple. It stood there as imposing as ever, stretching out numberless lofty domes and spires like so many feelers toward the dull, cloudy sky, and shrouded in a strange mist of eeriness like a mirage hanging over a desert. Chapter 15. About a week later, Dr. Chak told me of a strange rumor that the house where Talk the poet had lived was haunted. By that time, the Kappa had moved out, and the house was now a photographer's studio. Chak told me that in every photograph taken in that studio, a dim image of the dead poet could be seen behind the picture. But the doctor was a materialist and did not believe in the immortality of the soul. Even when he himself told me that the house was haunted, he added with a malignant smile on his face, "The soul seems to be a material being just as the body is." I don't believe in ghosts either. But as I had a friendly feeling towards Talk the poet, I ran to a bookseller's at once and bought some newspapers and magazines containing the accounts and photographs of the ghost. There were lots of pictures, he kappas and she kappas, young and old, and behind each of them I certainly did see, though indistinctly, the image of a kappa who looked somewhat like Talk. But what was more remarkable was the articles, especially the report of the Society for Psychical Research. I translated it word for word into Japanese, as correctly as I could, the outline of which will be given below. The notes in brackets are mine. Report on the ghost of Mr. Took, poet. The Journal of Psychical Research. Number 8274. The Society for Psychical Research held an extraordinary inquiry meeting at number 251 Street, formerly the residence of Mr. Talk, poet, who committed suicide some time ago, but at present the studio of Mr. Photographer. The members present were as follows, names omitted. We 17 members of the Society for Psychical Research, headed by Mr. Peck, President, and accompanied by Mrs. Hop, our most trusted medium, met in a room of the above-mentioned studio at 10:30 answered, M. September 17th. As soon as she entered the studio, Mrs. Hop felt a spiritual atmosphere and, with convulsions all over her body, vomited several times. She said that this was because the spiritual atmosphere of Mr. Talk contained nicotine as the result of his indulgence in strong tobacco. We members of the society and Mrs. Hop sat silent at a round table. In 3 minutes and 25 seconds, Mrs. Hop fell into a trance quite suddenly and was possessed by Mr. Talk's spirit. We started to converse with the spirit who had possessed her in the order of our years. The questions and answers were as follows. Question: why do you appear? Answer: because I want to know what fame I have made after death. Question: do you departed spirits care for fame even after death? Some time ago had scorn for post-mortem reputation. Question: can you tell us the name of the poet? Answer: unfortunately, it has quite escaped my memory. All I can remember is one of his short poems in 17 syllables, which he seemed to like very much. Question: how does it go? Answer: the old pond, and the sound of a frog leaping into the water. Question: do you think it is a good poem? Answer: I don't think it is a bad one, but it would have been a masterpiece if the poet had substituted a kappa for the frog. Question: why do you think so? Answer: because we kappas are very eager to find the kappa in any work of art. Here President Peck called our attention to the fact that we were not having a joint review meeting, but an extraordinary inquiry meeting of the Society for Psychical Research. Question: Flo, do you spirits live? Answer: just as you do. Question: do you regret having committed suicide? Answer: not exactly. If I should get tired of spiritual life, I will come back again to this world of yours by killing my spiritual self with a pistol. Question: is it easy for a spirit to commit suicide and come again into this world? Mr. Talk's spirit met the question with another question, which would have seemed quite like him to those who had known the poet. Answer: is it easy for you to do away with yourselves? Question: are you spirits immortal? Answer: there are so many different opinions about our immortality that it is almost impossible to tell which is the right one. Please don't forget that among us too there are Christians, Mohammedans, Parsas, etc. Question: what do you believe in? Answer: I am always a Nothingarian. Question: but at least you don't doubt the existence of the spirit, do you? Answer: I'm not so sure as you are. Question: how many friends have you got? Answer: I have my friends in all ages and climates, probably not less than 300. The most famous among them are Kleist, Mainlander, Weininger. Question: are all your friends suicides? Answer: not all. Montaigne, for example, who defended suicide, is one of my respected friends. But I don't keep company with such a fellow as Schopenhauer, a pessimist who did not kill himself. Question: how is Schopenhauer getting along? Answer: he has established spiritual pessimism and is now discussing the question whether it is right or wrong to kill one's spiritual self and come into life once more. But having learned that cholera is one of the diseases caused by bacteria, he seems to be feeling very much relieved. We questioned him, one after another, about the spirits of Napoleon, Confucius, Dostoevsky, Darwin, Cleopatra, Buddha, Demosthenes, Dante, Sinnoh-rikyu, etc. But to our regret, Mr. Tak did not give sufficient information. Instead, He asked several questions about his personal affairs. Question: Now tell me about my reputation after death. Answer: A certain critic said that you were one of the minor poets. Question: I suppose he is one of those who have a grudge against me because I didn't present them with my books of poems. Has the complete collection of my poems been published yet? Answer: It has been published, but it seems to be selling very slowly. Question: In 300 years, when my poems are out of copyright, everyone will buy a copy. What has become of my female friend who lived with me? Answer: She has married Mr. Lack, the bookseller. Question: Poor thing. I am afraid she doesn't know that Lack has a glass eye. What about my child? Answer: He is in the National Orphan Asylum, I hear. Mr. Talk was silent for a while and then resumed his questions. Question: What about my house? Answer: It has become a photographer's studio. Question: What about my writing desk? Answer: No one knows anything about it. Question: I had a bundle of treasured letters in one of the drawers, but fortunately you are too busy to be curious about them. Well, I think I must be going now. Dusk is gathering slowly in the world of spirits. Goodbye, friends. Goodbye, my honest friends. With these words, Mrs. Hupp suddenly came to herself. We 17 members of the society swear before God to the authenticity of the foregoing questions and answers. P.S. We paid for this service of Mrs. Hupp, our trusted medium, according to the daily allowance she had once got from the stage. Chapter 16. This and other articles on Talk's ghost threw me into a melancholy mood, and I no longer enjoyed life in that country. So I decided to come back to this country and live among my fellow human beings. But I did not know where the pit into which I had fallen was. How I walked about in search of it. Then one day Bag, the fisher Kappa, told me that there lived an old Kappa in the suburbs of the city, enjoying a quiet life, with a flute and books for companions. I went there without delay, hoping that he might be able to tell me the way out of that country. But I did not find any old Kappa in the hermitage, which was a very small house. Instead, a tender-headed child Kappa, apparently not more than 11 or 12 years old, was playing a flute with an air of serene contentment. I wondered whether I had come to the wrong place. But on asking his name, I found that he was the very old Kappa whom Bag had spoken of. But you look like a child. You don't know anything about me yet. By some fortune or other, I was gray-haired when I came out of my mother's womb. I grew younger and younger, and now I am only a child, as you see. But if you ask my age, well, maybe I'm about 115 or 16, assuming that I was only 60 years old when I was born. I looked round the room. There was something about the plain chairs and tables, it seemed to me, that suggested the purity and happiness of a saintly life. You are happier than any other Kappa, I suppose? Well, maybe I am. I was old in my youth and am young in my old age. So I'm not so covetous as old Kappas generally are, nor am I a slave to lust like young Kappas. Anyway, my life has been at least peaceful, if not happy. I see. Surely that would bring one peace of mind. Not always. One cannot enjoy a peaceful life without health and wealth. Fortunately, I've always been in good health and inherited sufficient means to support myself all my life. But what has contributed most to my happiness is, I think, that by good fortune I was already an old Kappa when I was born. I talked for a while about Talk, who had committed suicide, and about Gail, who saw the doctor every day. But somehow the old Kappa did not seem to take much interest in those subjects. Then you have no positive desire to live, like other Kappas, have you? Gazing at my face, the old Kappa replied calmly, "Well, I left my mother's womb like any other Kappa after I had given my answer in the affirmative to my father's question whether or not I wanted to be born into this country. But I fell into this country by mere accident. Would you kindly tell me the way out? There's only one way out." "Well, and that is the way you came here by." There was something in that answer that made my blood run cold. "But I can't find it." The old Kappa stared at me with his bright, youthful eyes. Then he stood up slowly, went to a corner and left the room, and pulled a rope that hung from the ceiling and opened a skylight which I had not noticed before. And through that round skylight I could see branches of pine trees and cypresses, and beyond them a clear, bright sky. I could also see Mr. Yar Igadake thrusting its peak into the blue sky like an enormous arrowhead. I jumped for joy like a boy who had caught sight of a flying airplane. "Now, you can go out by that skylight," said the old Kappa, pointing to the rope, which was not an ordinary rope as it had seemed to be, but a sort of rope ladder. "Thank you very much. Goodbye." "Just a minute, young man. Are you sure you'll never regret having left this country?" "Oh, yes. I shall never regret it." And the next moment I was scaling up the rope ladder, farther and farther away from the concave head of the old Kappa. Chapter 17. When I returned from the land of Kappas, I was greatly upset for some time by the smell of men. Compared with human beings, Kappas are awfully clean. Moreover, the human head struck me as being a very uncanny spectacle. I am afraid you don't see how I felt about it, because you have never lived among the concave-headed Kappas. Besides, the human nose, I have not much to say against the eye and the mouth, but the human nose certainly has something about it that inspires you with fear. For some time I took great pains to keep human beings away, but little by little I got used to them, and in the course of half a year or so I began to go anywhere and see anybody. But one thing that embarrassed me very much was that I often dropped into the Kappa language during the conversation, as, for example, "Will you be at home tomorrow?" "Qua." "What?" "Oh, I shall be at home." Then, about a year after my return from the land of Kappas, I failed in an enterprise and here Dr. S. interrupted patient number 23 by saying that he had better drop the subject. According to the doctor, he gets so wild whenever he touches upon it that even the nurses cannot keep him under control. Very well, then I'll not say any more about it. Anyway, I made a mess of it, and that caused me to wish to return to the land of Kappas. Yes, I wished to return, not to go. For at that time I had a longing for that country as if it had been my dear old home. I slipped out of my house and was just about to get into a train on the OM line when unfortunately I was caught by a policeman who brought me to this hospital. For some time after I came here I kept on thinking about Kappas and their country. How was Jack the Dr. Kappa getting along? Was Mag the philosopher meditating on something or other, as he had always been, under that 7-color glass lantern? Above all, How was Lap, the rotten-beaked student fellow who had been my best chum? One cloudy afternoon like this, when I was absorbed in these recollections, I was startled to see a Kappa bobbing his head just in front of me. It was Bag the Fisher Kappa. As soon as I recovered myself, well, I don't remember whether I wept or laughed, but certainly I was deeply moved to find myself speaking again in the Kappa language after so long a time. Hello, Bag. What has brought you here? Your illness, sir. How do you feel, sir? How did you know? The radio, sir. And Bag smiled triumphantly. I see. But I wonder how you managed to come at all. Oh, it's a soft job. All the waterways in Tokyo are nothing but highways to Kappas. I remembered the fact which I had quite forgotten that Kappas are amphibians like frogs. But there's no waterway hereabout. I came through the water pipe. And then, just opening the fire plug, you open the fire plug. Yes, sir. Have you forgotten that there are machinists among Kappas too? After that, many Kappas came to see me every 2 or 3 days. Dr. S says that I am suffering from dementia precox, but according to Check the Dr. Kappa, I am quite all right. He says, an insulting remark, to be sure, but he says that it is you and Dr. S and people like you that are victims of dementia precox. Since even Jack the doctor came to see me, it was of course natural that Lap the student and Mag the philosopher followed suit. But no Kappa turns up during the daytime except Bag the Fisher Kappa. It is at night, mostly on moonlight nights, that 2 or 3 of them come together. Last night again I had a chat in the moonlight with Gale, president of the glass manufacturing company, and Mag the philosopher. Besides, Krabak the musician obliged me with a tune on the violin. Look at the bunch of black lilies on that desk over there. Krabak brought them last night. I looked back, but of course there was nothing to be seen on the desk. And this book is a gift from Mag the philosopher, who brought it all the way to me. Just read the first poem. Oh, I'm sorry. You don't understand the Kappa language. Well, I'll read it for you in Japanese. This is a volume from Talks Complete Works published recently. Patient number 23 opened an old telephone directory and began to read the following poem in a loud voice. Among bamboos and flowering dates, Buddha's long been fast asleep. And with the wide red wayside fig, Christ is also dead, it seems. But rest we must, actors all, even right before the scenes. And the back of the finely painted scenes is with patches and patches of dirty canvas patched. But I am not so pessimistic as this poet. So long as my Kappa friends come to see me now and then, oh, I've omitted to tell you one thing. You remember my friend Judge Pep, don't you? That Kappa went off his head altogether after he had been dismissed from office. I hear that he is now in a lunatic asylum in the country of Kappas. I should like very much to go and see him, if Dr. S would permit me to do so. February 11th, 1927.